Hey everyone, we are back. Sorry, I had to go because my back was hurting bad, man. And so I'm back. Let's try to solve or learn um, this thing which is React testing. Okay, so where are we? Were we in this guy? Yeah, and we were in this folder. So, okay. Yes, so we were in this form, and okay, so we got this two item and we got the test up and running. So let's try to run the test again and see if is Prettier working on this guy. I don't think so. Dismiss, dismiss, everyone dismiss, cancel, retry, or just cancel out. Okay, I guess I have to put a Prettier file, but it's okay. uh, so let's run npm run test on this. Oh my god, my system is running slow, I suppose. I'm just running 3 application. Two are passed. Okay, two are passed, and let's do one thing. Let's start writing the other test, in which we wanted to test out what um once I once the user clicks once the user clicks the like enters the information. Okay, so enters the information and hit the send button. It should trigger what? It should trigger the function which we have called. So let's try and put like mimicking users, or let's call it adding user. So once we have done that, what we need to do is we need to first of all render the UI. Then we'll write down the steps that we have to do as he did. We need to get the input. Okay, once we, or instead of get, find the input. Find, or let's say we already found the input in the above test case, right? Get the input for name and email. Then we need to enter the text for name and email. Then we need to get the button and click it. click it, and then the callback function should get called. So I'm not sure how we should implement it. Back function should get called. Okay, so first of all, let's try to do what we have understood so far. We know render function helps us to render the UI, so we call that user form. Okay, we do this, but we haven't passed the function, the callback function in here yet, but we'll see that later. And we know by doing this, by doing these two, we can get our input and email, sorry, the text box, input text box, and I can paste this button element here. So but as we are going to get just two elements, like from the above test we know that we'll get two elements, so we can destructure those two. Let destructure those bad boys. So name input, as Stephen also did, email input, that would be. So yeah, once we got the hold of both of them, we need to add the text to those, right? So how should we do that? So we have something called as user event, or just user, I'm not sure, but I need to take the reference of it. So I'll be heading back to the Udemy and then see what we exactly need to do. I know I'm just learning, so it's just me learning. That is how I need to do it. Or if you know any other better way, please let me know. I don't have a single user so far, which is good.
Let's start to wrap up this test. The first thing we have to do is find the button inside the form.
Okay, so user dot, if I do user dot keyboard, then it, but how should I import the user? Like where does the user come from? Import user from what? I need to check that. So
run our tests and just make sure that we're kind of on the right path for right now.
Okay, simulating user events, right?
The next test we're going to add is definitely working as expected. That's why it calls on user add. You'd call the on user add called on user add. Name and the email. Here we have a test around this. All right, submitted. Implement doing things. We'll then take a, so that's what I really want. Simulate type, make sure, I have a role text box. All right, to find the text typing, we're going to simulate a click event. And if we ever need to simulate pressing a control character, such as the command key or the enter key, arrow keys, and so on, we'll put in the name of the key and surround it by curly braces. So for example, user.keyboard, curly braces enter is going to simulate pressing the enter key.
Oh, okay.
So in our case, we want to simulate first clicking on the input, because we need to focus calling keyboard, name input, and then user.key to attempt to type to focus it. First, curly braces enter, the braces, or the enter key, arrow. If we ever need to simulate pressing .click and user.keyboard. The two most important functions, typing.
So user, okay, it comes from user event itself. So they were right. User event or user event from @testing library but user event. Okay. So now to in order to mimic the user event, we do click, or no, sorry, keyboard. We do this, and what we write as chain as he did. Let's write chain, and okay, first user dot clicks name input, and then user uh, writes, and then click email input, and then user dot keyboard. Keyboard is used to mimic if the user is typing, like mimicking the action of user typing into the input box. So that's what we are doing here. And one more thing that Stephen mentioned, that if you want to mimic a particular key press, suppose let's say enter, then you have to type it like this. But we don't want uh, any specific key to be entered. So let's say once he has done that, okay, so our task of this, we need enter the text. We have entered it for both name and email. Now we need to click the button, right? So click button element. We found the button element by screen dot get by role button. And okay, so here's the tricky part. Now we want to call the should get function, and I need to see this how he has done it. It's taking longer than I anticipated, but I'll do my best to stream till night
for right now. So I'm going to save the file, go back over to my terminal. Whenever we render this thing, now our test is going to pass with the correct email. I'll show you one possible way of doing this. And it's not really the best way, but it's going to kind of work for right now. Remember, this is not the best implementation, so we're going to fix this up and put in something better in just a moment. Right above our render call, I'm going to define a new function called callback. Whenever this function is called, I'm going to receive all the arguments that it gets called with by putting in ... args. I'm then going to define an array right above called arg list. Whenever callback gets called, I'm going to take the arguments that was provided and I'm going to push them into arg list. So we can do that with an arg list .push args, like so. So if you look at callback, this function really just records what it gets called with, it stores them in that array, and that's all it does. It really doesn't do anything else. I'm then going to take that and provide it to onUserAdd. So now what does this really do for us? Well, now whenever we try to submit our form, we should be able to take a look at arg list and see inside there the list of arguments that onUserAdd, or our function, was provided. So we can use arg list right here. We can use this array to verify that our callback function actually was called, and that it was called with an appropriate email and password. Or, excuse me, email and name. I keep saying email and password. I want to make sure it gets called the appropriate email and name. So here's one way we could do that. We could write out expect arg list to have length 1. So that's going to make...
Okay, so what we can do is, as we want to mimic a callback here, what Stephen suggested is we need to do is that, what was the name of the form? So it was what? Okay, yeah, handle submit, we are calling in the handle submit, right? Okay, so handle submit will need a callback, right? So here we are calling the callback, and we have to define our own callback here. Callback is equal to, it will take args as he said, and then what we'll do is we'll also have args list is equal to an empty array. So this args list will push the args. Okay, so whatever arguments that we'll pass, that we need to push, and that callback this callback is getting passed here. So assertion of the added, so check if the user was added. So expect, now after click, what should we expect is this handle submit will be called, and this callback will pass this Jane and Jane at their Gmail here, right? That's what is supposed to happen on this call, right? I hope so. Let's see. I hope so. Expect arg list dot length dot to be one. So let's see. Okay, it failed, but why? User dot click user is undefined. Oh, this got defined twice. Okay. Cannot read property of click. Okay. Why don't they just give, instead of this zip, they should have gave a simple, you know, GitHub URL or something, so that we don't have to download each time. Extract all. Oh my goodness, it's gonna take a hell lot of time. By the way, I'm using I think I think I should stop streaming and just do my work. But streaming really feels me that I really have to pay attention to what I'm doing, and yeah, like it really helps me to be focused rather than, you know, slacking here and there, slacking around. So, okay, so if we do this, oh, everything passed, looks like. Am I right? Yeah. so just that was missing, so we should have tried it again. But we don't need this guy. Shift delete. I've just recently cleaned entire C drive. Hopefully it was cleaned, but I don't see any performance upgrade happening, like performance change in my laptop. So yeah, okay, so we are done with this. So yeah, so this is not a good way of doing it. That's what Stephen is saying. So let's quickly see what it really means. So let's go here, and I guess he was going to show it in the next video.
All right, my friends, time to fix things up. So again, this is not the best implementation we put together inside of this test. We're going to figure out exactly what's wrong with it and figure out how to make a couple of improvements. So the first thing I'd like to fix up is this callback setup right here. I know this part of the code right here is a little bit confusing. The idea is we need to verify and make sure that whatever we pass down as the onUserAdd prop actually gets called, and we need to make sure it gets called with the correct arguments. So this is one kind of hacky way of doing it. But it turns out that recording and making sure that functions actually get called is something that happens all the time in our tests. It happens so often, as a matter of fact, the Jest testing framework gives us a little tool to kind of automate this process of making sure that a callback function gets called and make sure that it has the correct arguments whenever it gets called. So this is going to be something called mock functions. A mock function is a fake.
Okay, so my camera just went off. Let's see. What we have here. Come on, man. This is not done. Okay. How should I fix this? Okay. हाँ क्या? Okay guys, gotta go.
a function that doesn't really do anything when it is called. All it does is record the fact that it got called, and it also records the arguments that it was called with. So you can think of it as being almost identical to this very simple code that we just put together right here. This is a function that doesn't really do anything when it is called. It just records whatever arguments it received. That's it. The word mock in English, just in case you're not a native English speaker, means not real. So whenever you see mock functions, it means kind of like fake or not real. We most often use mock functions whenever we need to make sure that a component actually calls a callback. There are several other cases where we are going to use mock functions, and we'll see many uses of these things over time inside the course. So let's take a look at a diagram to understand what's going on here. So we're going to create a mock function. We're going to pass it down as the onUserAdd prop to our user form. The mock function is going to have some internal storage of sorts. It's going to record how many times it has been called. It's also going to record all the different arguments it receives whenever it gets called. So we're going to pass that down as the onUserAdd prop to our form. We're then going to simulate the form submission. And whenever we submit the form, our component should call this function, and it should provide some name and email inside of an object. So the mock function is going to store that argument it received, and it's also going to say, oh, I was called, so I'm going to increase this counter right here. I've been called one time. We can then write out a couple of assertions to make sure that our mock function was called exactly one time, and we can also make sure that it was called with the correct arguments. So essentially do the exact same thing we have already done in our test, but do it in a more appropriate way, rather than making this kind of fake callback thing, as we have done. It's a little bit challenging to understand. Okay, so here's how we're going to create and test a mock function. I'm going to delete this arglist and callback right here. I'm also going to delete the comment because we are on the way to doing a correct implementation. I'm going to create a variable called mock. This is going to be jest.fn, like so. So this is how we create a mock function. It is simply jest.fn. Mock is now a function, so we can call this thing if we want to. And whenever we call it, it's going to have some internal storage. It's going to keep track of the fact it was called. I'm going to take that mock function and pass it down to the onUserAdd prop. Then later on inside of our test, we're still going to type inside the input, and then submit the form. After submitting the form, we need to, again, make an assertion. We need to make sure that the mock function was called and that it received the appropriate props. Jest has some built-in matchers to make sure that a mock function gets called and to make sure it gets the appropriate props. These matchers are going to be expect mock to have been called. So that's going to make sure the mock function just plain was called and that it got called at least one time. We'll then also make sure that it received the appropriate arguments. There's another matcher to verify the arguments the mock received. So it's expect mock to have been called with. And then we can put in as an argument here what argument we expect the mock function to have received. So once again, for us, it will be an object with a name of Jane and an email of jane@jane.com. So name of Jane, email of jane@jane.com. All right, let's save this. Back over to our terminal. And there we go. Looks like our test is still passing. So the code that we have now and the code we had before is pretty much equivalent. We were passing down a function just to verify that it got called at some point in time and make sure it got called with the appropriate arguments. But we're usually not going to write these functions out by hand. Instead, we're going to use these mock functions just because they greatly simplify the testing process. Now, that is not the only thing we need to fix up inside of our test. There's one or two other things, so let's fix those up in just a moment. Let's take take a look at the next thing to fix up inside this test. So the next problem is around this find to input step right here. We are currently trying to find all the different elements inside of our component that have a role of text box. And then the real issue here is that we assume that there's always going to be exactly one input that's going to serve as the name input, and another one's going to serve as the email input. The reason that this is an issue is that our components change over time. We might eventually decide to add in additional inputs to our form. So back inside of user form JS, we might decide to reorder these inputs. For some reason, we might decide that putting the name second and the email first is better. We also might decide to add in additional inputs, so maybe something like age or something like that. If we make just about any change to these inputs, be it the order, their name, anything like that, well, we're going to start to have a failing test here. So we would say that this test is brittle. It is brittle, it is easy to break, because if we change the ordering of the inputs, if we decide to add in additional inputs, this test is going to break even though the component itself might still be working correctly. So the current way in which we are finding these two inputs is not that great. Let's find a better way of doing this. So a better way is going to require us to understand a little bit more around forms and inputs and labels in particular. So here's a little bit of backstory. All right, so this is a label and an input element. I want to tell you a little bit around some normal, traditional HTML stuff. So this is not really React specific. If you are ever creating a label with an input next to it, you can give the label a for attribute. In JSX, we have to write it out as HTML4, but if you were doing normal HTML, it would be just for. If a label has an HTML4 that is equal to an input element's ID attribute, then clicking on the label is going to focus the input. Let me give you a quick demonstration of this. So back inside of our component, here is user form. I'm going to find the name label. Actually, let's do email first. So on the label, I'm going to give this thing a HTML4 prop of email. And then on the input right after it, I'll put in an ID of email. So we have now created a pairing between these two different elements. If I save this, go back over to the browser, and then if I find the label for the email right here and click on the label, the input will be selected. If I go up to the name and click on the label, the input is not selected. So this is just a little accessibility and usability thing, particularly for mobile devices, where a user might accidentally tap on the label when they really mean to select the input. We can take advantage of this nice little feature when we are trying to select or find particular elements inside of our tests. So let me show you how this relates to our testing. Okay, here we go. So if we have correctly set up the pairing between a label and an input, then we can select the text input very easily and make sure we get the correct one by using either of these two selecting functions, these two query functions. So one way we could do this is by calling screen get by role, look for an element with the role of text box, and then put in a second filter object that has a name with a regular expression of enter email. The name attribute here is going to take a look at the label's text. In this case, my label has enter email. So it's a regular expression. It's going to look for some label element with text of enter email. It's then going to find the paired input element, the element that is paired up with that label. So in this case, it is the input right there. So this query function is going to find the input. Another way we could do this is by using another function called getByLabelText. You might be able to guess what this does. It's going to find some label that has text that matches this regular expression of enter email, and it's going to give us the input element that is associated with that label. So either of these query functions would be absolutely appropriate to use. Now, React Testing Library itself prefers or recommends that you use roles to select elements. So we are going to go with the recommendation. We're going to use the getByRole technique. All right, let me show you how to do this. So first off, back inside of user form.js, I'm going to find our first label input. I'm going to make sure that label has an HTML4 of email for the email, and the input has an ID of email. I'm then going to repeat that same process for the other label input pair. So for the label, I'll give it an HTML4 of name, and the input, I'll give an ID of name. Then back inside of our test file, we now have a much better and slightly more specific way of finding the appropriate text inputs. So we can now remove this query function right here and replace it with name input is screen get by role text box, and we'll put in a name with a regular expression. And the label for the name input was just name. So name like so. We're going to put in an I on the regular expression, which is going to make the regular expression not worry about lowercase or uppercase characters. We'll then also find the email input. So screen get by role text box. This one is going to be enter email. We could also just put in email by itself, and that will match against just the email part of that string. Okay, let's save this now. And if we flip back over to our test run inside the terminal, it looks like the test is passing. So the very nice thing about this approach here is that now our test is a little bit more flexible. We can add in additional labels and inputs, and it's not going to cause our test to break. We can also reorder our inputs. We can change the order. We can put the email first and the name input second, and the test is not going to break. So what we're really testing here is exactly what the test says. We're making sure that we can type in some text, and the form is going to call the appropriate callback whenever it is submitted, because that's what we really want our test to do. And we don't really care so much about whether or not the inputs are in the correct order. All right, so this is a good improvement. And I would say that this test is now in a pretty good spot. So we started off with not so great a test and made a couple of changes to refactor it into a much better and flexible test. We have added in some pretty good tests around the user form component. So we're now going to move forward and take a look at testing the user list component. Remember, the user list is going to receive a list of users or an array of users as a prop. So this should be an array that has objects. and every object should have a name and any columns and is passed in. So let's think about what is critical or what is important around this component and decide on what we want to test. Well, I'm going to make a couple of arguments here. I'm going to say perhaps we should try to make sure that the table shows one line per each user. We also might want to verify that it shows the correct name and email for each user as well. Now, this is a very simple component. It's a simple table. Do we really need to add in a bunch of tests? Well, it really comes up to you and the project you are working on. Some engineering organizations are going to say we want to test every component. Others are going to say we really only want to test the most critical and most complicated components inside of a project. So we're going to take a look at testing everything, but it's really up to your engineering organization or the job you're working at to decide what is an appropriate test. Okay, so let's get to it. To test the user list component, we first need to create a new test file inside of our project. Inside the src directory, I'm going to make a new file of user list test.js. At the very top, I'm going to add in an import statement for render and screen from @testing library/react. I will also add in an import for the user list component, which is inside of the same directory, so it's just a /. In the last test file, we also had an import for user if we need to simulate input or really kind of any input, so maybe typing on the keyboard or clicking. The user list component doesn't have any event handlers. There's nothing related to user input that we really need to test. So in this, once I've got this put together, I'm going to save the terminal. We still have Jest configured. So to run test inside of this new user list test file, I'm going to again press W. I'm going to search for, I'll hit enter. And now it doesn't have any tests inside of it. But of course, we're going to fix a new test file that description here would be a little bit more email and name of each user. If I stub this one, the tests are going to be very similar. All the rows, correct number of rows in the table, specifically one row for each user. To get started, inspect tree. So I'm going to make a fake list of users right above two objects, email of Jane, and an email or a component, and elements that have been rendered by our component. We're going to use that query by role or get by directly off the top. Get by. Let's take a pause right here before this video gets too long. When we come back in just a moment, I'm going to show you a fantastic tool that we can use to very easily get an idea of how to best select elements that have been rendered by our component. We are rendering our component, but now we need to figure out how we can find the number of rows that have been rendered. Now in this case, you might not know off the top of your head how to write out a query function. And remember, query functions allow us to find elements that have been rendered by our component. So you might just not know off the top of your head how to write out a query function to find all these different rows. Fortunately, there's a really nice tool we can use, a nice little trick to help us understand how to find particular elements. Okay, so again, memorizing all the query functions, all these roles, it's challenging. So if you ever need a little help, we're going to go into our test, and inside of one of our tests, we're going to add in a little line of code. It is screen log testing playground URL. Notice URL is capitalized, all three letters. Whenever you run this function, your test is going to take all the HTML that is currently rendered by the component, and it's going to generate a link that includes that HTML. And it's going to send you off to an online tool called Testing Playground. Now, the only way to really understand what's going on here is to play with this ourselves a little bit. So let me show you how this actually works. Back over inside my test, right here, I need to write out a query to somehow find the number of rows. I don't really know how to do that. So to fix this, I'm going to add in screen.log testing playground URL. When I write that out, you'll notice I get a red underline. And if I hover over it, it says unexpected debug statement. So this is not an error message that is popping up. It is a little bit more of a warning. It is saying, hey, just so you know, you've got a line of code in here that is going to try to console log some stuff while you are running your tests. It's really just a warning to say, don't forget you've got this extra little bit in here. So again, not an error, totally fine. I'm going to save this. I'll then go back over to my terminal. And where my tests are running, I'll now see that I get a console log of a pretty long URL. The URL is going to go to testingplayground.com. You'll notice that there's a long kind of sequence of characters. That is all of the HTML that your component produced in an encoded format. So this link right here includes all the HTML produced by our component. Okay, I'm going to take this link right here. I'm going to change over to my browser, and I'm going to navigate to that link. And I'll see a page like this up here. So this is Testing Playground. And again, it is all about helping you write out these query functions correctly. Once you come to this page, you'll notice on the top left-hand side is a little code editor. And this is our HTML that was produced by our component. So it has been automatically loaded up into this little editor right here, and we can see a preview of it on the right-hand side. Now on the right-hand side, we can click on different elements manually. And whenever we click on one, we will be given a recommendation on how we can write out a query function to find that particular element. So for example, if I click on Jane, I will be given a recommendation right here. I will be told that I can find that element by writing out a query function that looks like this right here. So as you guess, this is really fantastic for understanding how to use these query functions and roles in particular. And whenever we're testing HTML running, I'll now see that is going to try to console logs and stuff while you're running your tests. It's really just a warning to say, don't forget you've got this extra little bit in here. So again, not an error, totally fine. I'm going to save this. I'll then go back over to my terminal. And where my tests are running, I'll now see that I get a console log of a pretty HTML that your component produced in an encode query function to fantastic for understanding how to use these query functions and roles in particular. Left here, it's probably going to work like box will show up as green and we'll say, hey, we really recommend you use this particular query. At the end of the day, we're usually going to take a look at this box right here, and if it gives us a recommendation, we are going to try to use it. This tool has one other downside. Right now, you and I are really trying to find these TR elements. We're trying to find the rows. We care about the rows. That's all we care about. So if I tried to click on one of these rows, well, no matter how much I kind of move my cursor around, I can't quite seem to highlight the entire row. It just seems like I can't click on the row itself. And so it's kind of hard for me to get a recommendation on how to select just the TR element. If you are ever in that scenario, we can use a little bit of a trick. We can add in some custom styling to the HTML right here directly, just to add in some additional padding, essentially, to make elements easier to click. So for example, I'm going to find this TR right here. I want to try to select it. I want to get a suggested selector, but I can't click on the TR. So as a workaround, I can go to the TR, add in a style attribute with maybe a border 10 pix solid red and a display of block. So now that TR element has a huge red border around it, and I can very easily select the row. And so I can select it, click it, and I'll be given a suggested query right here. Hey, if I do a get by row role with row, I'll be given that element. So you sometimes are going to have to use this little styling workaround again, just to
Okay. I guess I'll continue this after some time. Sorry, guys.